A hush descended over the Red Keep long before dawn, the air so still it might have been painted into the sky rather than set upon the living, breathing world. Ned Stark, who had once been the proud warden of the North, stood in the chill darkness of his cramped cell, quietly wrestling with the enormity of his fate. Candlelight flickered along the damp stones and cast his shadow on the wall, looming as a silent witness to his regrets and hopes. There was no wind here beneath the castle, no fresh breeze from the northern lands he missed, only the stale tang of King's Landing secrets and the ghosts of forgotten prisoners. One by one, the hours passed. At times, Ned closed his eyes and imagined the tranquil courtyards of Winterfell, the ring of steel in the training yard, and the faint hush of snow drifting from the sky. He missed his children more than he dared voice. In that darkness, he whispered their names as though the walls could carry them northward. But unbeknownst to him, far across the narrow sea, whispers of another kind had taken root. Daenerys Targaryen, mother of dragons, had learned of the vile treachery unfolding in the capital of the Seven Kingdoms. Though she was still forging her identity among the Dothraki, though she was still uncertain of her right to the Iron Throne, she could not ignore a piece of news that reached her by a quiet smuggler and a timid crow she had managed to sway. Ned Stark, the man who had once tried to help Robert Baratheon and the Targaryen line out of duty, was nevertheless an honorable lord who line out of duty was nevertheless an honorable. The message was murky and incomplete, but it compelled her to act, for it spoke of tyranny and fear in a city that some said might belong to her by birthright. The letter was full of details about a vengeful boy king named Joffrey and his ruthless Lannister mother, and about how Ned Stark had uncovered the terrible secret that stood at the heart of the Iron Throne's legitimacy. The letter closed with a plea, perhaps for help, perhaps for simple justice. Daenerys was not yet fully in command of her path, but she felt within her a rising tide of determination that was as unstoppable as the sea in storm. She had 3 dragons, barely half-grown, but full of potential and wreathed in an ancient magic she could scarcely begin to understand. Qarth had taught her not to underestimate them, nor to let others cage her ambitions. She had survived the flames. She had walked out of her husband's funeral pyre with 3 living miracles, and she was convinced those winged children of hers were part of some grand design, a destiny she could not afford to spurn. She conferred with Ser Jorah Mormont, the exiled knight who had grown more loyal to her than she had dared hope. He warned that Westeros was not the Dothraki Sea, that King's Landing was a pit of vipers where a single misstep could bring doom. But she saw in his eyes the flicker of belief, as though even he could feel the impossible potential in the wings of her dragons. They were small, yes, yet more ferocious each day. Drogon, black as midnight with red streaks that looked like running blood. Rhaegal, green and bronze, watchful and curious, and Viserion, pale gold and cream, often docile unless roused to wrath. When Daenerys said she wished to send them across the sea, half the Dothraki camp exploded in shock and disapproval. Many believed dragons must remain by her side to protect her, to ensure she could claim the Iron Throne. But her heart told her there was something more urgent at hand. She needed to test the reach of her power and see how the 7 kingdoms would answer. By candlelight in the back of her largest pavilion, Daenerys traced a map of the eastern coast of Westeros. She knew how wide the narrow sea was, how treacherous the crossing, but she did not flinch. Dreams of flight had visited her in the night. She had seen the spires of the Red Keep beneath a roiling sky, and she had felt her dragons tearing through the air, unstoppable and exultant. In her dream, there was a rescue, a swirl of chaos, and a clarion call to rally those who still remembered Aegon's name. "They can find me if I bid them," she whispered, pressing her palm to the soft, scaly hide of Drogon, who hissed softly in response, black wings rustling. Ser Jorah advised that perhaps she could buy a ship to sail them, and avoid unleashing them before they were ready. But Daenerys was adamant. The dragons had to fly, or they would never learn. Dragons and Targaryens were bound by blood and fire, and though she was not yet a queen in her homeland, she carried herself with the certainty that she had the right to intervene in the injustices inflicted by House Lannister. "One day I will claim the Iron Throne," she said, stepping outside where the moon coated the grass in a silvery glow. "But first, I would see a just man live, if I can." Thus, in the hush before daybreak, Daenerys knelt upon the dusty ground and murmured words of encouragement to Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion. She placed her hands upon their scaled necks one by one. The dragons snorted, eyes glowing with primal intelligence. The bond between them was not a thing that lent itself to the tongues of men, but it was powerful, enough to guide them, enough to send them across the sea. "Find him," she breathed. "Find the man who is about to be killed for honoring the truth." She did not speak of logistics, nor of how they would tear apart the city guard. She did not speak of the dangers or of the thousands of swords that might bar their way. She knew only that she had a purpose, and that her dragons were her sword and shield. With a thunderous beat of wings, they took to the sky, small but regal shapes framed against the paling horizon. Their roars shook the Dothraki from uneasy dreams. Daenerys watched them go with a tightness in her chest that was part wonder, part terror. They were her children, they were her destiny, and they were flying into the unknown. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, the tension in the city had reached a feverish pitch. Word had spread of Ned Stark's supposed treason. Many in Flea Bottom hated the Lannisters for the poverty and brutality that ran rampant beneath their rule. Some small folk in the city remembered Ned Stark as the quiet hand who had tried to root out corruption. Others had swallowed the official story that he had betrayed King Robert. But on one point, all agreed. The new boy king, Joffrey Baratheon, was untested, unpredictable, and cruel. On the eve of Ned Stark's sentencing, there was a hush in the taverns, a dread that slid into doorways and past shuttered windows. The Gold Cloaks patrolled with more vigor than usual. The Lannisters were consolidating power with an iron grip. Sansa Stark was among the first to notice something strange in the sky that evening. They had moved her from her quarters to a small suite that overlooked a courtyard. She had watched the gulls that circled in the bay beyond the walls, desperate for anything that would remind her of a world outside her fear and heartbreak. But what she saw, in the fading light, was no gull. She glimpsed a dark shape against the sky, a silhouette that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. Her heart fluttered. She rubbed her eyes, wondering if grief and worry had conjured illusions. A dragon was a creature of old stories. She had heard about them in songs, in the retellings of Aegon's conquest. The idea that she might see one in truth was too fantastical to consider. So she kept silent, hugging her arms to her chest, trying not to let her mind conjure illusions of rescue. Ned Stark's last words to her had been to stay strong, to keep her head high and trust in the old gods. But she found herself yearning for a miracle that might never come. Deep in the cells, Ned hardly slept. The night was cool, though the city above him was stifling. He found what rest he could upon the straw pallet, drifting in and out of uneasy dreams. He dreamed of his father and brother, the flames that had consumed them in the throne room of the Mad King. He dreamed of the long road home. He dreamed of the hush of the Godswood in Winterfell, and of the swirling snows that would signal winter's dominance. Each time he awoke, the darkness pressed closer, reminding him where he truly was. Yet in the darkest hour before dawn, he felt a strange presence, as though a ripple in the air had disturbed the gloom. He thought he heard a distant roar, something primal that did not belong in the Red Keep, and yet all was silent once more, save for the drip of water and the faint rustle of rats behind the walls. He wondered if he had finally gone mad from sorrow. That morning came slowly, gray and cold. The sky over King's Landing choked with clouds that hid the sunrise. Joffrey had commanded a public display in the great sept of Baelor's Square, or so the guards whispered. If Ned confessed his treason in front of the gathered throng, he might be granted mercy and allowed to live out his days on the wall. If he refused, the headsman's sword would have its due. Varys, the master of whisperers, visited Ned once more in the gloom, urging him to submit. "Think of your daughters," the eunuch whispered. "There is no honor in dying here. Live, so you might see them again." Though Ned despised the idea of speaking a lie, he loved his children more than his own name. He nodded heavily. Perhaps one day he could find a way to return, to expose the truth. But for now, he would do what he must to keep his daughters safe. Varys left him with a look of quiet sympathy, vanishing like a gray ghost into the passages of stone. Atop the walls of the Red Keep, Lannister guardsmen were already on edge. They had been told that something might happen, that Stark loyalists could attempt a last-ditch attack. The men fingered the hilts of their swords. Archers lined the ramparts, scanning the horizon. The wind carried the salt tang of the sea, and the smell of refuse from the city below. It was only mid-morning when one of the archers shouted, pointing eastward. High above, nearly lost in the haze, were three dark figures that bobbed and wheeled on the air, gliding closer each minute. The watchers were perplexed at first, uncertain if they were large birds or some trick of the light. Yet as the creatures drew nearer, the gasp of disbelief spread among the men. Scales caught the pale sun. Wings beat the air with unnatural grace. By the time the alarm bell began to clang, half of the city's defenders were staring at the sky in mute horror. Dragons, actual dragons, had appeared above King's Landing, 3 of them, slender but fierce. Chaos erupted in the streets. The small folk screamed and pointed. Mothers rushed indoors with their children. Men clutched at the 7-pointed star around their necks. Tales of the Targaryen dragons were legend, invoked only to recall how Aegon the Conqueror had subdued the realms. Yet these beasts were smaller than the ancient dragons of conquest, not giant enough to blot out the sky. Still, that did nothing to quell the city's panic. The gold cloaks tried to maintain order, yelling for calm, but it was no use. A city that had not seen a living dragon in over a century now found 3 silhouettes swooping over the spires of the Red Keep, letting out shrill roars that rattled windows and set horses to bucking. In the throne room, Cersei Lannister seized Joffrey by the shoulders and shook him, her eyes wild. "Go to your chambers," she hissed. "Let your Kingsguard handle this." Joffrey jerked free, trying to appear brave. "I'm the king. I give the orders." But a sudden roar overhead cut him off, and dust drifted from the vaulted ceilings. Men rushed about, swords clanging. The Hound barked an order to a cluster of guards. They would attempt to bring down the creatures with crossbows if they flew low enough. In truth, no one had a plan. Dragons were the stuff of nightmares, unstoppable, rumored to spew flame that could melt steel. Yet these were still small, might not breathe enough fire to incinerate battalions. The question was, had they come alone, or was there an army at their backs? At that same moment, Ned Stark was marched up from his cell into the courtyard, the bright light making him squint. They chained his wrists, binding him for public display. Yet the hush among the gold cloaks was not about him. They were looking skyward, passing fearful glances. Ned heard the roars. He too looked up and saw the dragons. For a moment, his breath caught in his throat. Part of him thought he must have lost his wits. Then, with a jolt of wonder, he realized this was no illusion. 3 dragons soared above the Red Keep. Why they had come, he could not guess. But he felt a faint surge of something like hope kindling in his chest. It was a mad notion, but if dragons existed once again, perhaps the world was not as straightforward as it seemed. The Lannisters, unprepared for such a threat, hastily rearranged their guard positions. Barricades were erected. Crossbowmen hurried to vantage points. The city's denizens thronged in the streets, risking a glimpse of the scaled beasts overhead. It was as though time had reversed itself to an age of old Valyria. The bells of the city rang out a discordant alarm, and ravens were sent scurrying to every lord within 100 leagues, bearing pleas for immediate reinforcements. High above, Drogon flew in the lead, his eyes burning with cunning. Rhaegal and Viserion flanked him like siblings in a dance, responding to Daenerys' distant call. It was a compulsion born of blood magic, and the link they shared. They circled over the Red Keep, scanning, searching, until at last they seemed to sense the presence of the man they had come to find. The next roar was so loud that the stones reverberated. Then all 3 dragons descended with a ferocity that no gold cloak could have predicted. Down below, Ned was being jostled forward, forced into a cart that was meant to take him to the Sept of Baelor. He glimpsed the sprawl of the city through the half-raised portcullis, and thought, ironically, that he might die beneath open sky. The guards were hastening, eager to get him to the site of his public confession before madness consumed the city. Some of the crowd pressed in on both sides, shouting curses or prayers. A flash of wings overhead drew Ned's gaze again. He caught sight of black scales glistening in the hazy sunlight, streaked with red. The crowd screamed as one of the dragons dove lower, teeth bared. The wing beats churned the dusty air, knocking men off their feet. Arrows soared upward, but Drogon twisted gracefully, evading them. A burst of flame belched from his maw, licking at the stone walls. The heat singed beards and raised blisters on exposed flesh. Rhaegal and Viserion followed, each spitting smaller jets of flame that set wagons ablaze and scattered the gold cloaks. A group of Lannister men tried to form a spear wall in one of the narrower streets, but the sudden onslaught of dragonfire made them shriek and drop their weapons. The small folk panicked, pushing and trampling one another in a desperate bid to flee. Smoke and screams, and the acrid smell of burning pitch spread through the air. Over this cacophony, the raw roars of the dragons rang again and again, as if calling out for something, or someone. Ned ducked down, chains clanking. The men around him cursed, trying to yank him forward. He realized that in the confusion, half their formation had broken, scattering in terror of the flying beasts. Could this be a chance to escape? He hardly dared hope for it, but in the swirl of chaos, it seemed anything was possible. Then, a golden-haired knight grabbed Ned by the shoulder, dragging him to his feet. Ned looked up into the sneering face of Sir Meryn Trant. "Keep moving," Trant spat, though there was fear in his eyes. All at once, a blast of fire streaked across the cobblestones, separating Ned and his captors. The heat bit at Ned's skin, though he managed to flinch away in time. Sir Meryn leapt back, howling as the flame caught the side of his cloak. The surrounding gold cloaks fell into disarray. It was Rhaegal, swooping low, that had unleashed the flame. His scales gleamed a burnished green in the swirl of black smoke. Viserion soared overhead, letting out a high-pitched cry that reverberated through the streets. Drogon perched momentarily on a half-shattered rooftop, a terrifying visage of black and crimson, before taking wing again. Ned found himself alone, half-chained with the manacles still around his wrists, but the link connecting them had snapped under the intense heat. He wasted no time. He broke into a stumbling run, ignoring the protest of his stiff limbs. The crowd parted in confusion, gold cloaks shouting contradictory orders. Overhead, crossbowmen on the walls tried to line up a shot, but the dragons were too swift, weaving between towers and parapets. Several bolts clattered uselessly off the stone or vanished into the smoky sky. The panic in the city escalated with every passing moment. Shops were abandoned, doors barred. Some prayed to the Seven, others cursed the Targaryen name. At the heart of it all, Ned Stark moved like a ghost, trying to find a path that would lead him out of the Red Keep's labyrinthine courtyards and corridors. The memory of the dragonfire, the blast of heat, still burned in his mind. He had never wanted any part of Targaryen retribution, not after Robert's rebellion. Yet it seemed that fate had brought dragons to King's Landing once more, and they were not flying banners of war, at least, not yet. They seemed almost searching. Above him, Drogon unleashed a terrifying roar. Ned glanced up and saw that the black dragon had locked eyes on him, or so it seemed. The beast dove, and for a moment Ned's heart lurched, convinced he was about to be engulfed in flame. Instead, Drogon beat his wings in a downrush of wind, landing heavily on the far side of the courtyard and sending men scrambling. The dragon stared, unblinking, as though measuring Ned with an ancient, knowing gaze. Ned could sense the raw power emanating from the creature, the smell of sulfur and brimstone. Somewhere in the swirl of panic, the hound led a squad of gold cloaks who rushed forward with spears. They advanced carefully, fear etched on their faces. Drogon hissed, rearing up. Ned wanted to shout for them to hold, but it was no use. The men flung their spears. 2 spears missed entirely, clattering to the ground. A third struck Drogon's flank but glanced off, failing to penetrate the dragon's scales. With a savage roar, Drogon snapped forward, jaws closing around the nearest soldier. Blood sprayed. The gold cloaks recoiled in horror. Fire burst from the dragon's gullet, and they scattered. The stench of burnt flesh was overwhelming. Ned fell to his knees, coughing, tears burning his eyes from the smoke. He felt something heavy nudge him from behind. Turning, he found himself face to face with Viserion, the pale dragon, whose jaws were parted slightly. Viserion bent low, exhaling a gust of hot breath. Ned fought every instinct that screamed at him to run. He reminded himself that the alternative was certain death in the madness around him. Distantly, he wondered if the Targaryen girl, Daenerys, had sent them. If so, for what purpose? A chorus of horns rang out from the castle gates. Reinforcements from the Lannisters had arrived. Heavily armored knights with crossbows and more men at arms. The dragons screeched, turning their heads to watch the new threat. Ned, seizing his chance, rose shakily and pressed a trembling hand to Viserion's scales. He felt the dragon flinch, but it did not attack. Instead, it let out a sound somewhere between a growl and a whine, as if torn between the violence it was unleashing and something else, some deeper command. Then, from a vantage point along the walls, Ned saw Sansa Stark, her copper hair a tangled halo, eyes wide with terror as she was dragged by a pair of gold cloaks. She was searching the carnage for something, perhaps for him. Ned's heart twisted. She was in danger, caught in the tidal wave of violence. He started toward her, but was forced back when Drogon bellowed a torrent of flame to keep back a charge of Lannister knights. The courtyard echoed with screams as the ground blackened, and the knights fell to the scorching heat. Time seemed to stretch in that smoky chaos, each breath bringing new horror. Ned looked around desperately for a path that might lead him to Sansa or to any hope of safety. The dragons overshadowed everything, roaring, slashing, and breathing flame at those who attacked them. But none of them turned their wrath on the fleeing smallfolk, as if Daenerys' command was etched into their bones. Rescue the wolf, do not bathe the city in indiscriminate fire. Even so, the presence of dragons in the midst of the capital was a cataclysm that threatened to unmake the order of things. At last, Ned caught sight of an opening in the melee. 2 gold cloaks were dragging Sansa down a side passage, presumably to keep her as a hostage. With desperate speed, Ned sprinted after them, ignoring the pain of his shackles. Smoke clogged his lungs, but he pressed on. Viserion followed behind him at a distance, skirting piles of rubble and burning debris. Ned barreled into one of the gold cloaks before he had time to react. The man staggered, and Ned snatched up a dropped short sword. Sansa screamed, and the second guard swung a cudgel at Ned's head. Ned blocked with more instinct than skill. He was weary, battered, half-starved, but the need to protect his daughter filled him with a final surge of strength. He knocked the guard off his feet with a well-placed kick, sending him crashing into a cart. Sansa broke free, running into her father's arms. He hugged her fiercely, tears in both their eyes. But their reunion was cut short by a savage roar as a group of Lannister soldiers rushed to corner them. Ned raised the short sword, though he knew it was futile. They were outnumbered, and he could feel Sansa trembling behind him. Then, as if guided by some miraculous sign, Rhaegal burst into the lane, jaws parted wide. His roar made the soldiers cower. A jet of flame erupted, forcing them to dive aside. Before Ned could react, Viserion surged forward, protective in its stance, as though forming a barrier between the Starks and those who would do them harm. Ned didn't pause to question it. He grabbed Sansa's hand, his voice hoarse. "Stay behind me. Stay low," Viserion hissed, stepping forward on powerful limbs, talons scraping the ground. Flames licked at the corners of its mouth. The Lannister men turned and ran, hearts seized by terror. In that instant, Ned realized they had a path to escape the Red Keep, if only they could navigate the labyrinth of chaos. Sansa clung to him, tears streaking her soot-stained face. "Father, what is happening?" she pleaded. He had no simple answer. All he knew was that the city was on the brink of upheaval beyond anything seen since Robert's rebellion, and at the center of it were 3 dragons who seemed to have some quiet purpose that spared his life. Together, father and daughter made their way through the smoke-choked corridors and broken gates of the castle. Drogon soared above, occasionally unleashing fire to keep the gold cloaks at bay. The black dragon's fury was unmatched, but still they could hear crossbow bolts whistling through the air. Some bolts found their mark, embedding in the dragon's hides, drawing enraged roars. The city guard was starting to rally, no doubt spurred by Cersei's frantic orders to protect her Sun King at all costs. Yet for every bolt that struck home, a swath of destruction followed as dragonfire turned knights into screaming ashes. In the midst of the city's madness, a faint hush began to spread around the great sept of Baelor. Even the small folk who had fled there seeking sanctuary looked on with dread. They saw shapes in the sky, heard the thunderous wing beats that rattled the stained glass windows. The High Septon cowered behind the altar, muttering prayers that the Father above might spare them from this horror. The bells tolled in desperation, echoing a cry for deliverance. But the city's pleas went unanswered. The dragons had come. Ned led Sansa around a crumbling courtyard. Debris rained down from above, the sky blackened with smoke. A stray crossbow bolt thudded into a wooden post near Ned's head. He grimaced, urging Sansa to keep her head down. "We need to find Arya," he whispered, "if she was still in the city at all." Arya had vanished, possibly escaped, but the thought of leaving her behind cut at him. They emerged into another courtyard, only to find it choked with the bodies of soldiers. Blood ran in rivulets. In the distance, Ned thought he spied Cersei Lannister at a balcony, her face twisted in rage as she shouted orders at the gold cloaks. Next to her, Joffrey clutched the railing, his mouth contorted in a silent snarl. Ned couldn't hear their words, but he could see the hatred on the boy's face, the panicked fury in Cersei's posture. Then a shadow fell across them. Rhaegal swooped overhead, unleashing a roar that swallowed the sound of Cersei's commands. The queen recoiled, dragging her son back inside. Ned exhaled shakily, not quite sure what to feel. All his life, he had believed that Targaryen dragons brought only destruction. Yet here they were, possibly saving his life. Steeling himself, he guided Sansa onward. They pressed through narrow alleys now filled with rubble. Burning thatch from rooftops had collapsed into the streets. The cries of wounded men mingled with the agonized whinny of dying horses. The clang of swords rang from distant skirmishes. The wings of dragons beat overhead with an uncanny rhythm, sometimes close, sometimes receding. Each time they dove, Ned braced for a fresh wave of heat and terror. Yet the dragons seemed to be systematically dismantling the city's defenses, scattering them as if driving them away from one place in particular. At length, Ned reached a vantage point along the city walls, half collapsed. Leaning against a jagged break in the rampart, he could see the Blackwater Bay beyond, hazy under a sky thick with swirling smoke. His heart pounded. He tried to quell his trembling so Sansa would not see how frightened he was. The city was in flames in several quarters, but the largest fires were concentrated near the gates and the barracks. He realized that if this continued, King's Landing would suffer a blow it might never recover from. Joffrey's reign might be ended before it truly began, unless the dragons were driven off by some miracle of cunning or luck. Yet the Targaryen girl, Daenerys, had not come in person, or so it seemed. There was no sign of a Targaryen banner, or an invading army of Unsullied or Dothraki. Perhaps she was waiting across the sea, sending only these three-winged beasts as her heralds. Ned found the thought unsettling, but he could not deny the strange gratitude that blossomed in him for the opportunity to see another dawn. Without the dragons, he would likely be standing on a scaffold before the great sept, awaiting the swing of Ilan Payne's sword. He turned to Sansa. "We must find a way out of the city," he said quietly, conscious of how she trembled. "We'll go north. I can only pray your sister finds us, or that I can find her before we leave." Sansa nodded tearfully, wiping soot from her cheeks, her eyes darting at every sound. They made their way along the battlements, stepping gingerly around collapsed chunks of stone, passing the bodies of archers who had tried to hold the walls. A roar from above startled them. They looked up to see Drogon descending, battered by crossbow bolts that had lodged in his flank. His black scales glistened with blood. But if he was wounded, his rage seemed to give him strength. He let out a torrent of flame that raked across the ramparts, forcing any surviving guards to flee for their lives. Ned and Sansa ducked behind a broken crenelle, shielding themselves from the blast. When they risked a glance back, the dragon was perched on the far side of the wall, ignoring them entirely. Its tail lashed back and forth, knocking aside a shattered ballista. A moment later, Rhaegal and Viserion appeared, flanking Drogon as if to protect their sibling. Ned felt his heart pounding at the immensity of their presence, so close by. The three dragons roared in unison, a triumphant and terrible sound that echoed over rooftops and soared past towers. Then a strange hush fell over the ramparts. The dragons grew still, their sinuous necks craning toward the sea. Ned followed their gaze and saw, out on the water, a set of sails. Several ships had gathered in the bay, likely the city's defense or merchant vessels trying to flee. But one ship in particular, small and swift, bore a sail that Ned did not recognize. The dragons released a series of shrieks, as if calling out across the distance. A tremor of realization coursed through Ned. Could Daenerys be on that vessel? Had she come to see the result of unleashing her children? Before he could unravel the thought, the dragons unleashed another terrifying cry and took flight once more, soaring out over the walls in a rush of wind. The city behind them blazed with fires that would not soon be quenched. Screams rose from every quarter. The Lannisters might rally, or they might be undone. Ned watched as the three dragons circled once overhead, as though ensuring that their quarry, Lord Stark, was truly free. Then Drogon banked and flew eastward, with Rhaegal and Viserion trailing. They vanished into the bank of smoke that lay over the rooftops, and in moments they were gone from view. Ned staggered, feeling the enormity of it all. He still had no proof of who had sent the dragons or why, but it was impossible not to guess. The name Daenerys Targaryen lay on his tongue, but he said nothing aloud. He squeezed Sansa's hand. "We must go," he murmured. He had no illusions that the Lannisters would give up searching for him. Yet the city was in such disarray that there might be a chance. The realm would have to grapple with the truth that dragons lived once again. And as the living symbol of House Targaryen, Daenerys had made her first move. Perhaps in an unexpected attempt to spare the life of a man once aligned against her family. Step by careful step, father and daughter navigated the city's battered gates. There, they found crowds of frightened small folk streaming out onto the roads, many with wagons or sacks of belongings thrown over their shoulders. Behind them, King's Landing was a swirl of chaos, black smoke rising into the sky in thick coils. Occasionally, a roar from on high reminded them the dragons were still near. No one attempted to stop the fleeing crowds. So many gold cloaks had been scattered or slain. Ned kept his head low, concealing his face under the hood of a tattered cloak he found on a fallen guard. Sansa clung close, her eyes darting nervously. It took the better part of an hour to pass beyond the outer wards, for the throng was thick, and fear made people move in fits and starts. But soon enough, they found themselves outside the city proper, on a winding road that led to the countryside. Ned paused by a milestone. He felt the ache of exhaustion, the rawness of his shackled wrists. His eyes stung with sweat and smoke. Yet he was alive, miraculously, and his daughter lived with him. He swallowed the lump in his throat, recalling all that had transpired. Had the dragons truly been sent for his sake? If so, did that mean Daenerys Targaryen believed he would repay the rescue with loyalty? Ned frowned. He was no man for political games, but it was certain that the Targaryens had made a statement that day, one that would reverberate through all the Seven Kingdoms. Looking back one last time at the gates, the pillars of smoke blotting out the midday sun, Ned allowed himself a quiet moment to feel the magnitude of what had occurred. The city had not been taken by a foreign army, but it had been humbled by the might of creatures that should have been long extinct. The Lannisters' grip on the throne would waver in the face of this demonstration, and whispers would spread from Dorne to the north. Whispers that the Targaryen line was not broken. Perhaps this would herald war, or perhaps something else entirely. Ned could not guess. All he knew was that honor demanded he try to find and protect his remaining children, and see them safe. Sansa wept softly, overwhelmed by fear and relief. Ned drew her close, pressing his lips to her hair. "We'll find a way," he said, voice ragged with grief and gratitude. Perhaps Daenerys Targaryen would seek him out. Perhaps they would someday meet face to face. He felt the weight of old oaths, old wars, old wounds. He remembered the madness of the Mad King and the cruelty visited upon the realm. Would Daenerys be any different, or would her dragons bring the same ruin? There was no certain answer. But for now, at least, the dragon's arrival had spared him from the headsman's sword, and for that he could only whisper his thanks to the old gods, uncertain if they had heard. He set off with Sansa in tow, mixing into the tide of refugees. Now and then the sky rumbled with the distant echo of dragon roars. But he did not look back. He had his daughter's hand in his, and the gift of a second chance. The day was not won, but it was not lost either. And somewhere far away, Daenerys Targaryen might be standing on the deck of a ship, hearing the distant roars of her children, and knowing they had answered her call. In the swirling smoke and dying fires of King's Landing, a new chapter of Westerosi history had begun. The consequences were shrouded in the yet unwritten future, but the present was ablaze with the impossible truth. Dragons had returned to claim their place in the world once more, and they had come to save the life of Ned Stark. 3,000 words. Ned Stark did not know how far he and Sansa had walked, only that every step away from the shattered gates of King's Landing felt unreal. The day was heavy with heat despite the haze of smoke that dulled the sun. He could still taste the tang of ashes on his tongue. A part of him expected to wake in that cramped cell, expecting that all of this, the dragons, the chaotic flight, his improbable survival, was merely the delusion of a dying man. Yet each time he looked at his daughter, pale and frightened but undeniably alive, he felt a rush of gratitude that scattered the nightmare. Somehow, they had escaped. Their progress was slow. Neither had drunk fresh water in hours, and they were both weak from fear and from the harrowing press of the city's exodus. Hundreds, if not thousands, of people were spilling onto the roads, pushing wagons, clutching crying babes. The smell of livestock and unwashed bodies mixed with a lingering stench of smoke and scorched flesh. Occasionally Ned would see a dazed soldier with Lannister crimson across his tunic, wandering in search of a command structure that had all but collapsed. None recognized Ned, or if they did, they made no attempt to seize him. In the aftermath of Dragonfire, the lines of authority had dissolved into pure chaos. Sansa stumbled, nearly twisting her ankle. She caught herself with a gasp, and Ned steadied her. Her once fine dress was torn and blackened by soot at the hem. She had lost a slipper, somewhere in the crush of bodies, so she walked with one foot bare, wincing at every sharp stone. Ned wished he could carry her to spare her pain, but he felt as if his own limbs might give out at any moment. He had been living in the dark for so long, half-starved, half-broken. Now he forced himself to remain upright, if only for Sansa's sake. They found a patch of ground under a scraggly tree just off the main road and huddled there, letting the tide of refugees pass by. A few gave them suspicious looks, but most were too occupied with their own troubles to spare concern for a worn-looking man and girl. Ned set aside the broken chains that still dangled from his wrists and pressed his hand gently to Sansa's cheek. She was warm, flushed with feverish exhaustion. "I'm sorry," he said, though he was not sure for what. Perhaps for failing to protect her from the horrors she had endured in King's Landing. Perhaps for making her leave behind any illusions she had once had about chivalry and southern courtly life. She merely shook her head, tears building in the corners of her eyes. They rested in silence for a few minutes. The sun had climbed high enough to burn away the morning's fog, and though the air was still thick with smoke, a breeze occasionally swept by, stirring Ned's graying hair. Despite the turmoil in his heart, he could not help a faint sense of wonder that he was free to feel that breeze upon his face. He asked a passerby if there was water nearby. A stooped old man, leading a donkey laden with crates, grunted that a creek lay a quarter-mile south. Ned thanked him with quiet courtesy and helped Sansa to her feet. Together, they made their way through the thinning crowd, cutting across a rocky hill. Sansa stumbled again, her bare foot raw with cuts, but she pressed on with a determination that reminded Ned of Arya in some ways, though Sansa herself would never see that comparison as flattering. She was no longer a child who believed in gallant knights and happy endings. She had seen too many truths in too short a span. At last, they found the shallow trickle of water that the old man had mentioned. It was little more than a rivulet cutting across a bed of pebbles, but it was cold and clear. Ned knelt at the bank and dipped his hands in, relishing the cool sensation. Sansa drank in, trembling gulps, her eyes closed. He urged her to pace herself, to avoid making herself ill. She looked at him with watery gratitude and managed a nod, water dripping from her chin. After they had drunk their fill, Ned helped wash the grime from her face and arms as best he could. Then he tore a strip of cloth from the ragged bottom of his own tunic and carefully wrapped it around her injured foot, though it was not much of a bandage. The repeated kindness brought tears to her eyes anew, but she forced them back. "Thank you, Father," she whispered. Ned squeezed her shoulder. In the distance, they could hear the rumble of voices, the bray of animals, as more refugees streamed away from the burning city. Overhead, no sign of dragons remained. The sky was thick with gray smoke in one direction, but otherwise it was empty. He remembered how, in the final moments, the 3 dragons seemed to pause above the walls, as if confirming his rescue was complete. Before they vanished, he felt an uneasy swirl of gratitude and dread. He could hardly fathom that the Targaryen girl had sent them to save him. Once, he would have dismissed such a thought as madness. Now, after all he had witnessed, he was not so certain. "How will we find Arya?" Sansa asked, breaking the silence. Her voice trembled, but there was a steely thread of courage in it. Ned exhaled, smoothing a hand through his tangled hair. "I don't know," he admitted. "We can pray she slipped away into the crowds or found a friend to guide her. I'll ask along the road. We'll check the inns, the stables, anywhere a lost girl might hide." He tried not to think about the possibility that Arya had been captured by Lannister men, or that she might still be wandering inside the city's walls. For hours, they moved slowly along the winding road that led north and west. They stopped frequently to rest in the shade of sparse trees or behind crumbling stone walls. As the afternoon wore on, the steady flow of refugees thinned. Some sought to turn off on smaller paths leading to villages or distant farms, while others slowed from exhaustion or paused to regroup. Ned and Sansa soon found themselves near a smaller knot of travelers who seemed more or less peaceful, just folk escaping the chaos, not bandits or sellswords. They encountered an older woman with a kindly face, who, upon seeing Sansa's bare foot, produced an extra slipper from her bundle of belongings. It was not a perfect fit, but it was better than nothing. Ned thanked her profusely. The woman shook her head, glancing back at the haze that hung over King's Landing. "I only hope the gods are with us," she muttered, and hurried on. With each step, Ned's thoughts churned about the uncertain future. The realm was in disarray. The boy King Joffrey had shown himself cruel and rash, but now that dragons had struck at the very heart of his power, how would he react? Cersei would surely whip the city into a frenzy, calling for vengeance against House Targaryen. If she learned Ned Stark had escaped amid the carnage, her fury would know no bounds. The roads would be watched. The Lannisters had men everywhere, and winter was coming. At dusk, father and daughter found a sheltered hollow in the lee of a wooded hill. An abandoned fire pit told them that others had camped there, perhaps not long ago. Ned fashioned a small fire from dead wood, more for comfort than warmth. They had no food, but the water from the creek had at least given them some measure of relief. Sansa curled up beside him, hugging her knees, her eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. Night fell slowly. The sky was streaked with the last vestiges of sunlight, a deepening red reminiscent of the dragon that had seized Ned's fate only hours earlier. He could not help recalling the swirl of black wings as Drogon descended in the courtyard. The savage heat of the flames, the shrieks of terror from the gold cloaks, and that moment of stunned realization when the pale dragon, Viserion, spared him instead of roasting him alive. It was as though the entire realm had tilted on its axis, and the old certainties were crumbling to dust. Sansa fell asleep against his shoulder. In the dim light of the dying fire, Ned removed his cloak, the ragged cloak he had stolen from a guard, and draped it over her. Then he settled himself against the trunk of a tree, every muscle aching. He wondered if he would be able to sleep at all, but exhaustion tugged at him like a weight. Before he knew it, his eyes closed, and he tumbled headlong into uneasy dreams. He dreamed of Winterfell's courtyard, where a great black dragon coiled around the weirwood tree. Its eyes burned red, and its wings seemed to engulf the sky. He dreamed of Daenerys Targaryen, a pale wraith with silver-gold hair, standing in the crypts beneath the castle, whispering words he could not understand. He dreamed of Robert Baratheon's laughter echoing through empty halls, turning to coughing and then silence. Finally, he dreamed of the headsman's sword, but as it fell toward his neck, it burst into flames. He woke in a cold sweat just before dawn. The sky was still a dull gray, and Sansa was curled closer to the fire's last embers. His breath was ragged. He touched his neck out of instinct, feeling only his own clammy skin. The nightmares seemed to cling to him like cobwebs. They resumed their journey at first light, pressing onward through gentle hills and patches of forest. On occasion they heard distant voices, other travelers on the road, but Ned preferred to keep some distance. He felt safer not attracting attention, fearful that rumors of his escape would spread. If the Lannisters sent pursuit, he did not want to be easily found. He explained as much to Sansa, who clutched his arm and nodded. By midday, hunger gnawed at them both. Sansa's face was drawn, her lips pale. Ned's stomach clenched painfully, reminding him how long it had been since he'd eaten a proper meal. He scanned the roadside for anything edible: berries, mushrooms, even wild onions. They were in luck when they stumbled upon a small patch of blackberries among the brambles near a dilapidated fence. The berries were tart, but they offered enough juice and sweetness to chase away the worst of their hunger. Sansa ate them quietly, too weary to speak. When they resumed walking, Ned kept her in the crook of his arm, lending what little strength he had. His mind turned to thoughts of a safe haven. The most obvious was to head directly north to the Riverlands and beyond, to seek sanctuary with Robb Stark's forces. But that meant passing through territory that was already rife with conflict, with armies and scouts, and potential Lannister patrols. He wondered if there might be a friend closer by, someone who could shelter them for a time, and help them find Arya or arrange discreet passage north. Yet his old alliances were fraught with risk. Petyr Baelish's name arose in his mind, only to bring a flare of anger. That man was not to be trusted. Varys, the spiders seemed to spin his webs everywhere. But trust him? Ned dismissed the notion. If he was to keep Sansa safe, he had to rely on his own wits and the mercy of the gods. In late afternoon, they came upon a small clearing where a traveling peddler had set up a makeshift rest stop. He was a short, wiry man with a gap-toothed grin and a cart full of odds and ends: pots, utensils, second-hand clothes, bits of cheap jewelry. He also had a few sacks of dried apples and some stale biscuits he was willing to sell. Ned approached cautiously, rummaging for any coin he might have. But his pockets were as empty as his stomach. The peddler eyed Ned's worn attire and Sansa's battered slipper. "No coin?" the peddler asked, spitting to one side. Ain't you like all the rest, fleeing that devil's nest behind us? Suppose it doesn't matter. You got anything worth trading?" Ned's gaze dropped to the manacles around his wrists, each still attached to a short length of broken chain. In the Red Keep cells, they had pinned him with heavier shackles, but these were ironed, battered, and tarnished. He held them up. "Iron for your smith," he said. "There's some weight to it." The peddler squinted. "I suppose I could melt him down. Better than nothing." He scratched his chin, pondering. "Fine, I'll give you a half bag of those biscuits, and a handful of dried apples for that. The girl looks like she'll faint if she doesn't eat soon." It was hardly a princely meal, but Ned felt a flicker of relief. He nodded in gratitude. "Deal." With some difficulty, he tugged the manacles free of his wrists, hissing as the rusted clasps tore at his skin. He dropped them into the peddler's outstretched hands. The man weighed them thoughtfully, then rummaged in his cart for a small sack filled with biscuits gone slightly hard, and a pouch of apples that had wrinkled to near leather in the heat. "Here," the peddler said, passing them over. "But mind you, them biscuits are older than I am, so soak 'em in water if you can. Otherwise, you'll crack a tooth." Ned thanked him. Sansa clutched the sack of food as though it were a feast. She bowed her head, and the peddler gave her a sympathetic nod. "Best of luck to you both," he said, then hefted the broken manacles into the cart. "Got 100 miles or more to the Trident if you're heading that way. Maybe more. Depends on the state of the roads." Before Ned could ask anything else, the peddler snapped his reins, urging the old donkey forward. The cart wobbled away in a creak of wood and harness. Ned turned to Sansa, who swallowed hard. He could tell she was trying to maintain her composure in the face of mounting fatigue, despair, and unanswered questions. They found a small stream nearby, just enough water to soak the biscuits until they softened. It took time, but they each managed to eat 2 biscuits and some dried apple slices. Sansa coughed a little, choking on one of the biscuits until Ned patted her back and urged her to sip water. The taste was far from pleasant, but it was sustenance. When the meal was done, they sat in weary silence for a while. A cloud of gnats hovered over the stream, and the sound of chirping crickets began to rise as dusk approached. Sansa began to shiver. Whether from a chill in the air or the aftershocks of trauma, Ned couldn't say. He wrapped an arm around her and murmured soft words of comfort, though his own heart was heavy. At length, she spoke, her voice trembling. "Father, do you think Robb knows what has happened?" Ned stared at the deepening shadows between the trees. "Word will reach him soon if it hasn't already," he said. "The entire realm will be buzzing with talk of dragons." He could hardly bring himself to say the word aloud. "Robb is wise beyond his years, and he has the North behind him. He'll know how to move." Sansa nodded, as though trying to be reassured, but her eyes reflected the same uncertainty Ned felt. Would the North believe rumors of 3 dragons attacking King's Landing? Perhaps. Or maybe they would dismiss it as mad gossip. Ned suspected that ravens bearing urgent tidings would be flying in every direction, each account more frenzied than the last. And somewhere across the sea, Daenerys Targaryen would be plotting her next move, if she was indeed the one behind this. They trudged onward again, pausing only when night fully claimed the sky. They found another nook beside a tall oak tree, where moss made a soft enough bed. Ned kept watch for a time, scanning the darkness for any sign of torches or wandering bandits. The tired hush of the countryside lulled him, though, and eventually his eyelids drooped. He was too exhausted to remain vigilant all night, so he allowed himself to drift off. One hand curled protectively around Sansa's shoulder. The second morning dawned cooler, a slight breeze carrying scents of dew-wet grass. Ned woke with a stiff neck and a heart full of dread, remembering that he was a fugitive in his own country. He and Sansa shared what little food they had left. 2 biscuits and a few apple slices, before pushing on. For much of that day, they encountered fewer travelers. The wave of refugees was behind or ahead of them, scattered along various roads. Sometimes, they spotted columns of smoke rising from the horizon where smaller towns and outlying hamlets might have suffered their own share of confusion or violence in the wake of the dragon's assault. Ned found himself wondering if the Queen would send riders to chase them, or if she was too busy trying to restore order in King's Landing. Near midday, they heard the clop of hooves on the road behind them and instinctively ducked into a stand of tall grass by the roadside. Hearts pounding, Ned peered through the green stalks. A small group of 4 riders passed by, each wearing dingy half-plate and carrying short swords. He could not tell their allegiance, but they did not wear the red cloaks of the Lannisters or the gold cloaks of King's Landing. He waited until they disappeared around a bend before he and Sansa crept back onto the road. They managed another hour of walking before Sansa stumbled, pressing a hand to her head. She looked pale, her lips cracked. The meager food had given them only a brief respite. Ned felt a wave of guilt. He had no coin to buy proper supplies, and the realm was in chaos, making charity all the harder to find. They rested under an overhanging rock formation, where a trickle of water seeped from the stones. Ned let Sansa drink. He washed her face gently, murmuring encouragement. She tried to sit up straighter, blinking as if fighting dizziness. "I can keep going," she insisted, though her voice wavered. "We'll rest a little," he said firmly, stroking her hair. Then he rose, scanning the tree line and the hazy fields beyond. He had spotted a small structure in the distance, a farmhouse perhaps. If the inhabitants were kind, Maybe he could offer them labor in exchange for food. If they had already fled, he and Sansa might find shelter there for a night. As he debated whether to take the risk, Sansa's eyes drifted closed, and her breathing grew shallow with exhaustion. He resolved to try. Without help, they would both collapse before reaching safer lands. Stooping, he scooped Sansa into his arms, ignoring the protests of his own weary muscles. She made a soft sound, half protest, half relief, and looped her arms around his neck. Step by aching step, he carried her across the open ground toward the lonely farmhouse. As they drew closer, Ned saw that the fields were untended, overgrown with weeds. No smoke curled from the chimney, and the door hung ajar. Still, he approached cautiously, calling out in a low voice. No one answered. Inside, dust coated rough wooden furniture, and the fireplace was cold. A simple straw mattress lay overturned in one corner. The air smelled stale, as though no one had been here in days. He set Sansa down on a wooden bench, her head lolling against the wall. He took a moment to check each room. It was a modest dwelling, just a single bedroom, and the main space with a hearth and a table. A few scattering footprints in the dust suggested the inhabitants had left in haste. Perhaps they had fled to the city for safety before the dragons attacked. Or perhaps they had simply abandoned their home upon hearing rumor of war. Ned found a single clay jar in the pantry, half filled with water that had grown murky. He sniffed it. It smelled stale but not putrid. He set it aside. Under a loose floorboard, he discovered a small stash of dried beans and what might have once been strips of salted meat, though it was hard to tell if they remained edible. He carried them to the table and studied them in the dim light. The beans looked intact, though they might require a long soaking. The salted meat was so stiff he worried it might have turned, but any sustenance was worth testing. He tended to Sansa, who stirred when he splashed a bit of water on her forehead. She gave him a weak smile. "We found a roof at least," she whispered, taking in the bare walls. "Is it abandoned?" "It seems so," Ned replied softly. "We'll be safe here for a short while. I'll see if I can start a fire and boil these beans." "Wine?" It took time, but he managed to coax a small flame in the hearth using old tinder and scraps of wood that lay in the corner. He filled a pot he found with the stale water, dropped the beans in, and hung it over the fire. The meat he soaked in a separate bowl to remove the salt and smell. The aroma was none too pleasant, but necessity overrode revulsion. While the beans simmered, Ned checked each window. The land around the farmhouse offered clear sight lines, so if anyone approached, he would see them coming. The afternoon light slanted in, illuminating drifting motes of dust. It was strangely peaceful, a stark contrast to the carnage they had left behind. From here, King's Landing felt like a dream, or perhaps a nightmare that had begun to fade in the sunlight. Sansa dozed again, still weak, and Ned watched over her in silence. His thoughts turned inevitably to Arya. If she had escaped the city, she could be anywhere, hiding on some cart bound for the Stormlands, or in the back alleys of a half-burned quarter, or worse, lost or captured. His chest tightened. He knew Arya was resourceful, but there were so many dangers she might face alone. He closed his eyes and prayed to the old gods that she would find her way to safety, or at least to someone who could protect her until he could reclaim her. As twilight neared, the beans had softened enough to eat. Ned tasted them first, ignoring the fact that they lacked any seasoning. They were bland and a bit gritty, but they did not taste spoiled. He offered some to Sansa, who sipped from the wooden spoon as if it were a fine soup. Hunger made it a feast in their eyes. They shared the meager meal, chewing slowly. The salted meat remained tough and suspiciously pungent, so Ned decided to abandon it rather than risk illness. As they finished eating, Sansa rubbed her eyes. "Father, I keep hearing the dragons in my head," she murmured. "I can't stop seeing them, swooping and spitting fire. Do you think that they were sent to help us?" Ned paused. The flicker of firelight cast long shadows on the wall. "I don't know," he admitted, voice subdued. "It seems they saved me from the headsman's sword. Whether that was their intent or just circumstance, I cannot say. The Targaryen girl, Daenerys, if it was indeed her will, Then she must have some design that we don't yet understand. Sansa listened, eyes wide and reflective. She picked at the threadbare blanket she'd pulled over her legs. I was terrified, she whispered. But I don't know. Something about them was magnificent. I thought of the Psalms. The old songs of Aegon and his sisters. How they took Westeros in a storm of flame. He nodded, remembering how those songs had been part of every child's education, from the highest lords to the lowly stable boys. The Targaryen conquest had shaped the realm for generations, and now it seemed history was poised to repeat itself in some form. The possibility worried him deeply. The realm was already on the brink of war, with the Lannisters and the Starks at each other's throats. Adding dragons to the mix threatened to engulf them all in blood and fire. Yet, there was a glimmer of hope if Daenerys had chosen, for whatever reason, to extend a hand of mercy to an old enemy. Night deepened, and crickets sang outside the farmhouse. Ned and Sansa lay side by side on straw pallets they had dragged into the main room, close to the warmth of the fire. Sansa managed to sleep soundly, worn out by days of terror and exhaustion. But Ned remained awake for a long while. He sat with his back to the wall, the sword he had taken from a dead guard in King's Landing resting across his lap. It was not the fine Valyrian steel of ice, nor even a well-balanced blade, but it was something. He tried to ignore the nagging guilt that he had once been part of the rebellion that drove the Targaryens from power. That war had been fought for reasons he had believed in at the time. To end the atrocities of the Mad King, to protect Robert's claim, to safeguard the realm. But had that old decision now come back around, delivering him from certain death at the hands of King Aerys' successors? Or was there a deeper price yet to be paid? Eventually, he dozed. The night passed uneventfully. When he woke, dawnlight was filtering through the cracks in the shutters. He rose, stretched his aching limbs, and stepped outside. The morning was cool, dew clinging to the overgrown weeds. A soft rustling in the barn made him tense, but it turned out only to be a stray goat that had wandered in, nibbling at the straw. The goat bleated, eyeing him warily, then trotted off. He filled a bucket with water from the farmhouse well, testing it first for foulness, though it seemed clean enough, and returned inside. Sansa was awake, sitting up with the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. He offered her the bucket, and she drank gratefully. They finished the last of the beans for breakfast, scraping the pot clean. Their next steps were uncertain. The farmhouse was a temporary haven, but staying here too long was risky. Sooner or later, bandits or soldiers might pass by. Yet traveling exposed them to danger as well. Sansa set the wooden spoon aside and looked up at her father. "We should keep moving," she said, her voice stronger than before. "Even if it's only a few hours each day. I don't want them to find us if they send men." He nodded, proud of her courage. "We'll head north," he said quietly. "Perhaps we can skirt around any major towns. Find a smaller road that cuts through the hills. If we can reach the Riverlands and make contact with some loyal bannermen. Maybe the Tullys." He paused, thinking of Catelyn's kin. But the Riverlands might also be a battlefield if the war had truly begun in earnest. Still, it was better than remaining in the open. They gathered what few supplies they had. A small cooking pot, 2 wooden spoons, a battered bowl, and the clay jar. Ned splashed the remainder of the well water over the fire to douse it. Then he and Sansa stepped outside into the cool morning air, unsure of what the day might bring. He led her around the side of the house, checking once more that they were alone. The quiet felt too complete, as if the land itself was holding its breath. They walked across the field, noticing the goats' tracks in the tall grass. The sun had just begun to crest the eastern hills, painting the sky with pale gold and pink. As they reached the edge of the property, something caught Ned's eye. A blur of movement on the far side of the track. He held out an arm to stop Sansa, his pulse quickening. Peering between the slender trunks of a few young birch trees, he discerned a lone rider approaching, leading a second horse. The figure wore a cloak with the hood pulled low, obscuring their face. Ned guided Sansa behind a stand of shrubs, motioning for silence. They watched as the cloaked rider halted by the farmhouse, scanning the yard as if searching for inhabitants. The second horse snorted, pawing at the ground. Then the rider dismounted, tying both horses to a post. Ned's grip on the sword hilt tightened. Was this a bandit come to loot the house? Or a scout? Crouching low, he inched closer, keeping himself concealed by shrubs. Sansa stayed behind him, heart hammering. The rider stepped into the open doorway of the house, disappearing inside. Moments later, there was a muffled exclamation. Then the rider emerged again, walking briskly back to the horses. They carried something, perhaps the pot or the bowl Ned and Sansa had left behind. Ned cursed under his breath. He had hoped to leave no sign of their presence. The rider secured the object to a saddlebag, then paused, as if listening. Slowly, the hooded figure turned, scanning the area. Ned could almost feel the person's gaze sweeping across the yard. He tried to hold still, to give nothing away. But in the hush, the goat bleated from somewhere behind the barn, startling the second horse into tossing its head. The rider murmured, stepping forward, inadvertently moving closer to Ned's hiding spot. Ned took a breath. If the rider grew too suspicious and decided to search the thicket, there would be a confrontation, and he had no idea how skilled this person might be. He weighed his options: keep hidden and hope they left, or confront them on his own terms. Sansa's trembling hand touched his shoulder. She was torn between fear and trust in her father's judgment. Ned gave her a faint nod, signaling that he would act if necessary. Inch by inch, he slid around the edge of a shrub, trying to gain a better line of sight. The rider's hood slipped back slightly in a stray gust of wind, revealing a sliver of face. Ned caught sight of pale hair. Silver, almost. It startled him so profoundly that he nearly made a sound. His first wild thought was that this stranger might be Targaryen, but that made little sense. Then the figure spoke, a soft whisper, though the words were lost on the breeze. Their voice was light, feminine perhaps. Suddenly, a second noise came from the nearby woods, snapping twigs, quickly followed by a rough shout. "Ho! We've got a rider here." A deeper voice, echoing through the trees. The cloaked figure stiffened, hand darting beneath their cloak. Ned realized there might be others approaching from a different direction. A pair of men emerged from the tree line. They carried short spears and wore mismatched pieces of armor. Their expressions were grim, their eyes gleaming with the predatory look of brigands. "What have we here?" one growled, glancing at the horses. "Fine beasts. You alone, traveler." The cloaked figure took a step back, lifting both hands in a placating gesture. Ned could see a dagger gripped in the rider's right hand, half hidden by the folds of the cloak. The brigands did not yet notice. Sansa trembled behind Ned, who was torn between wanting to remain undetected and feeling an urge to intervene before these men decided to murder the lone rider. The first brigand moved closer, spear angled low. "I asked you a question. You alone?" "Yes," the rider answered, voice calm but firm. "I'm just passing through. I have nothing of value. Only a pot and a bowl I found inside. Will be the judge of what's valuable," the second brigand sneered. He snatched for the horse's bridle, eyeing the saddlebags. "What else you got in there?" Ned felt his body tense. The rider might have skill, but two men with spears were not to be taken lightly. He glanced at Sansa, whose eyes pleaded silently. He gave a quick motion of his hand. "Stay here." Then he rose to his feet, sword in hand, stepping out of the thicket. "Leave her be," he said, voice strong despite his weariness. All three turned sharply. The brigand's eyes narrowed, while the cloaked figure's mouth parted in surprise. Ned tried to project confidence. "There's no need for bloodshed," he added, sword angled at the ground but ready to defend. The first brigand spat. "Who are you to order us around?" He advanced, spear level with Ned's chest. His companion flanked him, leaving the rider momentarily forgotten. Ned's grip tightened on the hilt. Behind the brigands, the cloaked figure shifted, dagger sliding from beneath the cloak with measured grace. The rider took a half step forward, eyes fixed on the men's unguarded backs. Ned realized they might stand a chance if they worked together, though he did not know this stranger's skill. In a heartbeat, the second brigand lunged toward Ned with a sudden thrust of his spear. Ned pivoted, parrying with the sword in a clumsy but effective block. The metal clashed, sending a jolt up his arms. He hissed, stepping to one side. The brigand growled, tugging his spear free. Meanwhile, the cloaked figure sprang into action, dagger flashing in an arc that sliced the first brigand's arm. He cried out, dropping his spear as blood spattered on the grass. The second brigand, startled by his friend's scream, turned halfway, giving Ned an opening. Ned slashed with his sword in a desperate swing that bit into the brigand's thigh. The man bellowed in pain, stumbling. The rider lunged forward again, thrusting the dagger deep into the first brigand's side. He collapsed with a choked gasp. A stunned silence followed. The wounded brigand clutched his bleeding thigh, eyes wild. He saw his companion dead at his feet, and looked from Ned to the cloaked figure. Spitting out curses, he staggered back, then turned and limped toward the trees. Clearly deciding flight was his best option. Neither Ned nor the rider pursued him. Panting, Ned steadied himself. The adrenaline of the brief scuffle made his vision swim. He pressed a hand to his ribs, fearing he might have pulled something. The cloaked figure bent over the corpse, swiftly wiping the dagger on the brigand's tunic. Then they turned to Ned. In the hush, Sansa emerged from behind the shrubs. She froze at the sight of the body, her eyes widening. Ned held out a hand, warning her to keep back. The rider glanced at Sansa, then at Ned, and pulled the hood down. The face revealed was that of a woman, but older than Ned had first assumed, perhaps in her mid-30s. Her hair was indeed pale, though more white than silver, with faint lines at the corners of her eyes. She inclined her head in a curt nod of thanks. "Well done," she said, her voice raspy with tension. "He would have killed me if you hadn't stepped in." Ned let out a breath, wiping sweat from his brow. "You fought well yourself. Are you hurt?" She shook her head, then tilted her gaze toward Sansa. "Is the girl all right?" Sansa managed a shaky nod, still staring at the dead brigand. I'm fine," she whispered. Though her voice wavered, an uneasy calm settled. Ned retrieved his sword from the grass where it had fallen in the scuffle. He looked at the woman more closely. She was dressed in plain traveling clothes beneath the cloak. Sturdy boots, breeches, and a simple linen shirt. Her belt held another knife, and a small pouch that might contain coins. "Why did you come here?" Ned asked, weariness creeping back into his tone. She hesitated. "I saw smoke from some distance. I was looking for a place to rest, maybe trade. But the house was empty. Then I saw signs that someone had been there recently. Your fire footprints." Her gaze flicked to Sansa Kai. "You fled King's Landing?" Ned nodded, uncertain how much to reveal. "We did." She assessed him, noticing the sword and the protective way he hovered between her and Sansa Kai. "You'll forgive me if I don't share my name just yet," she said carefully. "But I mean you no harm. I lost my home some time ago, and I've been traveling since. My coin is nearly gone, so I rely on scrounging what I can. These are dangerous roads." Ned studied her face, looking for any sign of deception, but she gave little away aside from a guarded caution that mirrored his own. "I'm called Tully," he said, choosing a half-truth that might offer some protection. "This is my daughter. We're traveling north." She raised an eyebrow, as if picking up on the lie or half-lie, but did not press him. "Then our paths might align for a while. I'm heading north myself. Might we travel together for safety's sake?" He hesitated. The idea of taking a stranger along was risky, but he also knew it was perilous for him and Sansa to keep walking alone. The woman had at least proven capable of defending herself, and brigands were hardly the only threat. He glanced at Sansa, who gave a small nod. She seemed too tired to argue, and there was relief in her eyes at the thought of having another companion. "All right," Ned agreed finally. "We can travel together, at least for a time." A faint smile curved the woman's lips. She reached up, gently running a hand along the muzzle of the nearest horse. "You can ride if you wish, or at least the girl can. The horses are strong." Ned exchanged a look with Sansa. She was swaying on her feet, near the limits of her strength, so he nodded. "Shall ride," he said. "I'll walk." A moment later, Sansa was boosted into the saddle. Ned carried their scant belongings and walked beside the horse, while the woman mounted the second steed. The dead brigand lay in the yard, a reminder that peace was fragile. They left him there, with no time or reason to give him a grave. Together they rode and walked away from the farmhouse, heading into the northern hills. The air tasted of pine as they climbed a gentle slope. Ned's mind churned with questions about their new companion, about King's Landing, about Daenerys Targaryen and the dragons. But for now, each step away from the city felt like another step toward hope. Overhead, clouds gathered, promising eventual rain. Ned looked up, wondering if the dragon still soared somewhere above those clouds, out of sight. The realm had changed in a single day, and no one knew what storms might yet come. But as he glanced at Sansa, perched on the horse with a weary but determined expression, he felt a flicker of steadfast resolve. They would keep moving north, day by day, driven by the simple desire to survive and reunite their family. Whatever the future held, fire or blood, war or fragile peace, they would face it together. Ka-A. They traveled in uneasy silence for the better part of the day. Ned, on foot, kept hold of the horse's bridle as Sansa rode. The unknown woman, her pale braids swaying with each motion, rode slightly behind, scanning their surroundings with a practiced alertness that reminded Ned of scouts he had known in the north. The road wound through gentle hills and the occasional thicket of birch and pine. Sunlight cascaded in ribbons through the branches overhead, dappling the ground with flickers of light. A breeze brought the scent of damp leaves, as if a storm was gathering somewhere beyond the horizon. Sansa dozed fitfully in the saddle. She was recovering but still worn from their flight. At intervals, Ned stopped to let her stretch or take a few mouthfuls of water. Their supplies were scant. The half-filled clay jar sloshed with each step, reminding Ned that thirst would soon become a concern. The woman seemed to carry some provision of her own, but she made no move to offer or request anything unless necessary. She guarded her saddlebags closely. Afternoon light slanted across the landscape when they descended into a small valley. The grass here looked healthier, as though recent rains had spared it from the dryness afflicting the higher ground. At the bottom of the slope ran a narrow creek, shallow enough that they could see smooth stones on the creek bed. Ned paused, glancing over his shoulder at the woman. "We should refill our water," he said simply, keeping his voice neutral. She nodded without comment, reining in her horse. They guided both horses to the water's edge. The animals drank greedily, muzzle to muzzle. Ned offered Sansa a hand so she could dismount, and she slipped off the saddle, wincing as her feet touched the ground. She stretched her arms and rolled her shoulders. The woman swung down from her own horse with fluid grace, scanning the surroundings. The trees here leaned close, forming a half canopy that spilled enough shade to keep them cool. Ned knelt at the creek, carefully rinsing out the clay jar. They had no cloth to filter the water, so he settled for letting it flow in and out a few times, hoping to wash away any sediment or stale odor. At last he filled it and corked it with a stopper of twisted cloth he had fashioned. Sansa followed suit, cupping water in her hands to splash her face and mouth. She drank until her breathing steadied, a small sigh escaping her as she felt relief course through her body. The pale-haired woman stood watch with the dagger in her hand, though it remained half-concealed within the folds of her cloak. Ned admired her vigilance, a trait that hinted at a difficult life, lived on uncertain roads. He found himself wondering about her secrets, about what business had led her wandering alone before they crossed paths. Even as a portion of him remained wary, another part was grateful for her presence. At last, she glanced down at him. "We shouldn't linger here too long. Those brigands might have more men, or else we could run afoul of worse." Ned rose, setting the full jar aside. "A few minutes more," he said, glancing at Sansa to shout. "She needs to rest her legs." The woman studied Sansa a moment. "The girl's exhausted. You both look half dead." Ned tried not to bristle at her bluntness. "We've had a hard journey. Still have a hard journey yet ahead." She inclined her head in acknowledgement. "No doubt." She looked around, frowning at the overgrown banks of the creek. "We'll need a safe place to sleep tonight, somewhere less exposed than that farmhouse. We might find a grove of trees or a rocky overhang. Or an inn if we're lucky, but that might invite questions we don't want." Ned agreed with a small nod. An inn might indeed, mean prying eyes and rumors. Without coin, they'd be forced to bargain or beg, either of which would draw attention. And if word of Ned Stark's escape had begun to spread, any travelers who recognized him might decide to play informant for a reward. Better to stay hidden in the wilds a while longer. Sansa, sitting on a smooth stone by the creek, ran her fingers over the remnants of the bandage on her foot. "If only we could find my sister," she murmured softly. "She's somewhere out here, or maybe still in the city." The woman's eyes flicked to Sansa. "Another child?" Ned hesitated, then nodded once. "Yes, my younger daughter." A trace of empathy creased the stranger's features. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "It's a cruel world for a girl alone." Sansa bit her lip, a wave of sadness crossing her face. Ned, feeling that old ache, set a hand on her shoulder. "We'll find her," he promised softly, though the uncertainty weighed on him like a boulder. "For now, let's worry about surviving ourselves." Sansa nodded. She drew a shaky breath and glanced at the woman. If we do find an inn, I can work," she offered suddenly, her voice trembling with unspoken anxiety. "Help serve or clean, in exchange for a meal and a bed. I used to practice needlework, or I could. She trailed off, uncertain how to describe her meager skills in a way that would be useful on the road. Ned's heart twisted. He remembered how he had once hoped to see Sansa married off in a grand ceremony, fulfilling a noble role at court. Instead, she'd been dragged through horror and forced to see her illusions shattered. The woman gave Sansa a kind look, but said nothing. After a moment, she crouched by the water, rinsed her hands, and drank. Then she stood, wiping her mouth. "All right," she said at length, turning to Ned. "We should go. The horses are rested enough. And if we want to find shelter before nightfall, best we move on." Ned collected the jar, slinging it over his shoulder with a length of rope. He helped Sansa back onto the horse. Together, they pressed on, ascending out of the little valley and following what had once been a footpath, but now looked partially overgrown with weeds. The afternoon wore on, the sun climbing high and then beginning its slow descent. Birds flitted through the branches above, trilling occasional warnings at the passing strangers below. The land changed around them, becoming more rugged. The hills steepened, the trail twisting around granite outcroppings. They spotted no other travelers, which was both a relief and a concern. No sign of brigands, no sign of local farmers. Twice, Ned thought he heard rustling in the underbrush that might have been a fox or a wild boar. Each time the pale-haired woman gripped her dagger, ready for trouble, and each time the sound faded away. Near dusk, they found a place where the path dipped into a small ravine, the walls of rock rising on either side. A cluster of boulders and twisted trees formed a natural alcove. It was not entirely hidden from the path, but it was recessed enough that someone could sleep there without being too exposed. Ned surveyed it with care. Loose rocks suggested a minor rock slide in the past, but it looked stable enough now. "This might do," he said, glancing at Sansa. Her face was pale with exhaustion once more, her eyelids heavy, at least for tonight. The woman guided her horse around the boulders, checking the perimeter. "We'll want to set a watch, but it's better than sleeping in the open." She dismounted, tying her horse to a stout branch. Ned did the same, then helped Sansa down. The girl sank onto a relatively flat stone, letting out a small groan of relief. Her foot was throbbing beneath the makeshift bandage, and the rest of her body ached from long hours in the saddle. Ned gathered branches that had fallen from the twisted trees. The woman did the same, each moving carefully among the rocks. A hush settled over them. Despite her earlier wariness, the woman seemed content to cooperate for survival's sake. Once they had enough kindling, Ned built a small fire in the hollow of the ravine, arranging stones in a ring around it to contain the flames. Sansa sat close, soaking in the warmth as night began to settle. They had no real food besides the water and a few meager scraps left from the farmhouse. The woman rummaged in her saddlebags and produced a small pouch. She poured out a handful of dried chickpeas and some lumps of dried fruit, dividing them between herself and Ned and Sansa. She offered no explanation and asked for no payment. though Ned saw her wince slightly, as if rationing her supply. He inclined his head in thanks, not wanting to break the fragile sense of mutual trust. They ate the meager meal in silence, each mouthful a slow, deliberate attempt to trick their stomachs into feeling fuller than they were. The dried fruit was tart, leaving a faint bitterness on the tongue. The chickpeas were small and hard, requiring careful chewing. Eventually the woman spoke, her voice carrying softly over the crackle of the flames. "You said you're called Tully. That's a Riverland's name, isn't it?" Her gaze flicked to Sansa, whose hair glowed copper in the firelight. Ned's reply came slow. "It is." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, but not with hostility. "And your daughter?" "She looks more northern," she said, choosing her words carefully. Ned felt the question behind her observation but chose to sidestep it. "Her mother is of the north," he said. "We've traveled a great deal. It's made us a bit of everything." She hummed softly, letting the matter lie. Instead, she leaned back against one of the larger boulders, the dim light revealing faint scars across her forearms. Sansa watched her with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The tension of so much secrecy weighed on them all. At length Sansa broke the silence, her voice hushed. "Thank you for sharing your food." The woman nodded. "I can spare it for a day or two. After that." She trailed off, gazing at the fire as if calculating the uncertain future. "There's a village I passed through some weeks back, about 3 days north of here. If the war hasn't reached it, we might find a little trade there, or at least glean from the fields. Perhaps we can buy or barter for supplies." Ned turned the idea over in his mind. 3 days of travel in unknown terrain, with Sansa still not fully recovered. But it was a plan, vague though it might be. "How large is the village?" he asked, trying to gauge the risk. "Small," she said, staring into the fire. "A handful of cottages, a mill, a modest sept, likely to keep to themselves if we arrive quietly. But anything can happen between then and now." "We'll be cautious," Ned said. "No drawing attention unless we must." He was struck by how easily he had taken to furtive travel. A far cry from the man who once rode openly as Warden of the North, wearing his title and honor plainly. Necessity had changed him. They agreed on a watch schedule. The woman volunteered to take first watch, claiming she was not tired yet. Sansa curled up on a patch of grass near the fire, using her cloak as a makeshift blanket. Ned settled beside her, unsheathing his short sword, so it lay within arm's reach. The night sky overhead was clear, revealing stars that glimmered with cold brilliance. He tried to steady his breathing, to remind himself that for now, at least, they were out of immediate danger. When he next stirred, hours had passed. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly. Sansa was still asleep, her face slack with exhaustion. The woman crouched on a rock ledge, her silhouette outlined by the faint starlight. She did not seem to notice Ned's awakening. He eased himself up, grabbing his sword, and moved closer. "I'll take over," he said, voice hushed. "You should rest." She looked down at him, her expression unreadable in the dimness. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded, stepping lightly off the rock. "Wake me if you see anything," she said, tucking her dagger at her belt. "Or hear anything." She found a spot on the other side of the dying fire and lay down, though Ned doubted she would sleep deeply. He settled atop the rock, scanning the ravine in both directions. Moonlight cast pale shadows among the boulders. A breeze rustled the sparse leaves overhead. The hush of night pressed in on him, and memories of the Red Keep flickered through his mind. The stench of smoke, the roar of dragons, the horrifying realization that he was alive only through the intervention of a power he had never thought to see reborn. He tried to shake off the memory. For a few hours he kept watch, gripping the hilt of the short sword so his knuckles ached. He saw no movement besides the occasional darting of a bat across the starry sky. At intervals, he checked on Sansa, reassuring himself with the sight of her chest rising and falling in sleep. Each time, the ghostly shapes of dragons circled in the corners of his thoughts, reminding him how fragile and improbable their escape had been. Near dawn, he roused the woman briefly and lay down to snatch a final hour of rest. Her footsteps crunched quietly over the gravel as she resumed her silent vigil. It seemed to Ned that he had only just closed his eyes when the gray light of morning arrived, accompanied by the woman's voice calling them to wake. Sansa rubbed the sleep from her eyes, wincing as she stretched stiff limbs. The air was crisp, cooler than before. Overhead, the sky was streaked with pale lavender and the promise of a rising sun. They doused what remained of the fire with dirt and gathered their meager belongings. Ned helped Sansa back onto the horse, noticing the faint color returning to her cheeks. They followed the woman's guidance, heading north along the faint trail. Now that it was full light, Ned could see how the land sloped and fell in a series of ridges, forming pockets of rocky terrain that might hide anything, animal or human. He kept his sword at the ready, though his arms ached from unaccustomed strain. Sansa gazed ahead wearily, one hand clutched around the pommel of the saddle. Sometime after midday, they reached a ridge where the land opened out into a wide vista. The trees gave way to rolling meadows dotted with clusters of wildflowers, though many had wilted in the lingering summer heat. Far in the distance, a thin wisp of smoke rose lazily toward the sky. Ned squinted, trying to judge the distance. "That might be the village," the woman said, pointing. "Still another day or two on foot, but it's in that direction." Ned's shoulders tensed. Smoke could mean anything. Could be a cooking fire, or a camp of soldiers. She nodded grimly. "We'll proceed carefully." They descended the ridge, weaving between outcroppings of stone, each of them tense with unspoken worry. Around mid-afternoon, the sun beat down with renewed intensity, and they paused by a trickle of water seeping from the base of a limestone bluff. Ned refilled the clay jar while Sansa leaned against a rock, closing her eyes. The woman exhaled, gaze flicking back the way they'd come. "No sign of pursuit," she observed. "That's either good fortune or a bad omen. The Lannisters might be too busy dealing with the chaos in King's Landing to spare soldiers for a search." Ned frowned. "They won't be deterred forever. Eventually, news will get out that we slipped free." She gave him a sharp look. "Are you that important to them?" She asked it casually, but Ned sensed the pivot in her tone. He tried to school his features into neutrality. "We parted on bad terms." She studied him for a moment that felt far too long. Then she nodded, dropping the subject. "We'll just keep moving." They pressed onward until the sun hung low, painting the sky a deep gold. The day's travel had taken a toll, and Sansa leaned heavily in the saddle, eyelids drooping. By the time they made camp in a small thicket overlooking a narrow stream, Ned had to help her dismount. She nearly collapsed from fatigue. The woman, quiet as ever, found them enough firewood to build a small blaze, though the gathering gloom whispered of another cool night. Around the fire, they shared the last of the chickpeas and dried fruit. Ned felt the pang of hunger gnawing at him, and he could see Sansa's face, wan in the flickering light. He reminded himself that if they reached that village soon, they might find something more substantial. He prayed to the old gods that it would still be standing, that war or unrest had not turned it into another ruin. "Sansa," he said softly, passing her a piece of dried fruit. "Eat, please." She nodded, taking small bites. The woman also chewed slowly, eyes half-lidded. Ned could sense how her caution had softened somewhat over 2 days of shared struggles. Though she was no friend yet, they had saved each other's lives once, and that created a fragile bond of respect. After the meal, Ned drew Sansa aside, draping his old cloak around her shoulders. "Try to sleep," he said, keeping his voice low. "Tomorrow will be another long day." She gazed at him, her eyes reflecting the orange glow of the fire. "I'll try," she whispered. Fear still haunted her, an undercurrent that no gentle words could fully banish. But she lay down, hurling into herself, face turned away from the flames. The woman was rummaging in her saddlebag on the other side of the fire, her posture tense. Ned walked a small perimeter around their camp, checking the shadows under the trees. Nothing stirred except a solitary owl swooping overhead. Satisfied, he returned to the fire and found the woman watching him. "You should rest too," she said, gesturing at Sansa. "I'll keep first watch." Ned shook his head. "You took first watch last night. Let me do it." Her lips thinned. "I'm not tired." Yet her eyes betrayed a flicker of fatigue. He suspected she had the kind of constitution that ignored exhaustion and discomfort out of habit. Still, even the hardiest traveler needed sleep. He hesitated, considering how best to manage. "We can split it," he offered. "I'll watch a few hours, then wake you." She gazed at him a moment, then shrugged, relenting. "Fine, but wake me." She rose, crossing to her bedroll. With a sigh, she stretched out on her back, dagger still close at hand. Within moments, her breathing slowed, though Ned guessed she would awaken at the faintest hint of danger. He settled near the embers, feeding them a few more sticks of wood to keep the glow alive. The faint warmth was pleasant against the night's chill. His mind wandered, drifting to memories of Winterfell. He could almost hear the rush of water in the godswood, the gentle hush of pine boughs. How he wished he could wake tomorrow to find himself home, with his whole family safe. Instead, he was in a nameless stretch of land, an escaped prisoner, and a father who had lost track of half his children. He prayed, truly prayed, that Robb would hold the North together, and that Arya would find her way. Hours slipped by. The moon rose and set behind slow-moving clouds. At times, Ned dozed, only to jerk awake at the rustling of a branch or the hoot of an owl. He forced himself to remain alert. At last, deciding he needed some rest, he stood and approached the woman. She stirred instantly, eyes snapping open, her hand darting to her dagger. "Your turn," he said softly. She rolled her shoulders and sat up, stifling a yawn. "Right," she murmured. "Get some sleep, Tully." Ned moved to where Sansa lay. She was still asleep, a faint line between her brows hinting at restless dreams. Carefully, he settled beside her, using the edge of his cloak as a pillow. The night was quiet, but for the crackle of the fire and the hushed stir of leaves in the breeze. He closed his eyes, exhaustion tugging him into darkness. When dawn came, the woman was already dousing the fire. Her horse pawed at the ground, restless. Sansa, sitting up, rubbed her eyes. Ned rose, stiff-limbed, and joined them. The air smelled of damp earth and pine resin, a gentle scent that contrasted sharply with the memories of King's Landing's smoke and fear. They started off without breakfast. The woman was out of provisions, and so were Ned and Sansa Dot. Their only hope for food lay in the village she had mentioned. Sansa rode, holding the jar of water. Ned walked beside her, the woman riding a short distance behind them. They spoke little, each lost in thoughts of necessity and caution. By midday, they cleared a small copse of trees and found the land sloping downward again. Nestled in a shallow valley was a cluster of ramshackle huts surrounded by fields of tall grass and a few plots of meager crops. A single dirt lane wound between the huts, leading to a modest wooden septut. Thin trails of smoke rose from a couple of chimneys, suggesting that, at least for now, this place was inhabited. "There," the woman said under her breath. "If it hasn't been sacked, we might find something." She paused, scanning the surroundings. "Stay back. I'll ride ahead. See what the mood is." Ned hesitated. "We'll come with you. Strength in numbers." She weighed that. "If they're suspicious of strangers, you might draw notice. Let me talk first. I've been here before. Not enough to be recognized, but I know how they do things." Sansa shifted in the saddle, biting her lip. "We'll do as you say," she said, though her voice was small. She was tired of being turned away from every human contact, but she recognized the sense and caution. "All right," Ned agreed. "But we won't be far behind." He looked toward the village, where no sign of armed men was evident. An older man in ragged clothing was trudging along the edge of a field, stooped as he pulled a wooden hoe behind him. A few chickens pecked in the dirt near the huts. It looked peaceful, though Ned knew appearances could be deceiving. The woman nudged her horse forward and started down the slope alone, cloak drifting behind her. Ned waited with Sansa at the crest of the slope, partially hidden by a tangle of shrubs. The sun bore down, making beads of sweat gather on Sansa's brow. A quiet tension filled the air, as they both watched the woman approach the outskirts of the village. They saw her stop near the old man in the field. From this distance, they couldn't hear what was said, But the man paused in his hoeing and leaned on the handle, head tilted in curiosity. The woman's gestures were calm, her posture non-threatening. After a moment, the man nodded. He pointed toward a hut at the far end of the lane, then resumed his work. The woman rode on, disappearing between two huts. Ned had allowed several minutes to pass, scanning the horizon and the dusty track leading into the village. No one came running, no alarm bells rang. He exhaled slowly. "We'll go down," he said, helping Sansa guide the horse forward. They took a slow, cautious path, weaving through the high grass to avoid drawing too much attention until they neared the huts. As they entered the lane, the smell of manure and cooking fires wafted through the air. A scrawny dog barked once, then trotted away. A middle-aged woman carrying a basket of laundry gave them a startled look, but quickly lowered her gaze, scurrying back indoors. It seemed the arrival of strangers was unusual, but not cause for outright panic. Ned spotted the pale-haired woman near a hut with a straw-thatched roof, conversing with someone at the door. A younger man, possibly in his 20s, leaned in the doorway, crossing his arms as he listened. The woman said something, and the young man shrugged, then went inside. Moments later, he emerged with a small burlap sack, which he handed to her. When the woman noticed Ned and Sansa approaching, she lifted a hand in greeting. She hopped down from the saddle, slinging the burlap sack over her shoulder. "Barley," she said quietly. "They had a small surplus. Not free, mind you, but we can grind it or boil it. It'll keep us from starving." Ned inclined his head. "Thank you." He eyed the hut. "What did you trade?" She hesitated, then met his gaze. "A dagger from my belt. Not my best one, but decent steel. And a promise that I'd do a bit of work for them. Help fix a broken fence or two." She nodded at the young man, who was watching them with guarded curiosity. Ned understood the sacrifices. Daggers and weapons were precious on the road, but so was food. "We can help with the fence," he said, glancing at Sansa, who sat straighter in the saddle. "We're not above honest labor." The woman gave him a small, tight-lipped smile. "Then let's do it quickly, before nightfall. They're letting us use the barn out back to rest. We can cook the barley there, maybe get a decent sleep if we keep watch." "Demmin." Grateful, Ned dismounted Sansa and led the horse to the side of the lane. The young man introduced himself as Carl, though his words were stilted and uncertain. He eyed Sansa's dress and Ned's sword as though half expecting them to be outlaws. The woman smoothed the tension by explaining they'd come from the south to escape trouble, looking to head farther north. Carl shrugged, admitting that many folks had come through in the past months, seeking refuge or heading to join one lord's army or another. This small village was too poor to attract much attention from passing armies, which was their sole advantage. Carl beckoned them around to the back of the hut, where a stretch of wooden fencing leaned at an awkward angle, its posts rotted at the base. Ned set to work, removing the broken posts and digging new holes. The woman joined him, using a small shovel Carl provided. Her pale braid fell over one shoulder, and she soon stripped off her cloak to work more freely, revealing a worn leather jerkin. Sansa, trying to help, carried a bucket of water for softening the ground. Though she tired quickly, she insisted on making herself useful, determined to pull her weight. With combined effort, they managed to reset a portion of the fence, reinforcing the posts with stones and tamped earth. Ned found a hammer in the barn and used it to drive nails into replacement planks. The labor made sweat trickle down his temples, but the ache in his muscles felt oddly comforting. A reminder of simpler days in Winterfell's courtyard. Sansa paused often to catch her breath, but she persisted, refusing to rest until the job was done. By the time the sun dipped low, painting the sky with oranges and pinks, the fence stood sturdily, if a bit rough. Carl nodded in approval and offered them a place to tether their horses for the night. "You can sleep in that barn," he said, pointing to a squat structure at the edge of the property. "It ain't much, but the roof doesn't leak too badly, and no one else is using it." "We're grateful," Ned said, bowing his head. Sansa tried to smile, though exhaustion weighed her eyelids. Inside the barn, the musty smell of hay and dried manure greeted them. A small window, high on the wall, let in the last of the fading light. The woman untied her saddlebags, rummaging for a pot, then nodded at Ned. Let's see about cooking that barley. They found a sheltered spot by the barn's side, away from the hay, to build a small fire pit. Carl had been kind enough to allow it, warning them to keep it contained. The woman measured out some barley from the burlap sack, pouring water over it in the pot. Sansa sat by the fire, stirring as it slowly heated. She had grown subdued, letting the monotony of labor dull the sharper edges of her fear. While the barley simmered, Ned slipped inside the barn to check on the horses. The dust motes in the air reminded him of Winterfell's stables, each swirl of particles catching the last vestiges of daylight. He ran a hand along the horse's flank, feeling the tension of the long journey. Softly, he murmured calming words, though his own mind remained far from calm. He thought of the unknown future. Even if they managed to slip through this village unnoticed, countless perils lay ahead. The realm was in turmoil, with houses aligning for war. The north, his home, was likely bracing for conflict, and the crown was in Joffrey's cruel hands. And overshadowing all, the knowledge that dragons had returned. Was Daenerys Targaryen even now sailing for Westeros, or sending more of her winged children to bend the realm to her will? He pushed those thoughts aside and rejoined Sansa and the woman. The barley stew, if it could be called that, had thickened into a gluey porridge, but it smelled divine to their hungry bellies. They took turns eating from a shared bowl. Sansa coughed at the first spoonful, unaccustomed to the hot grain. But then she devoured it with surprising eagerness. Ned savored each bite, grateful for the simple relief of food. The woman ate sparingly, her brow creased in thought. She kept glancing toward the main cluster of huts, as if expecting someone to approach. "What do you see?" Ned asked softly, setting down the spoon. She shrugged. "Nothing yet. But we can't stay here indefinitely. Once we're rested, we should move on before someone less friendly catches sight of you and your sword." Ned exhaled. "Tomorrow we'll leave." She nodded, but her gaze turned to Sansa. "Your daughter is half dead on her feet. She needs more than one night, if you ask me. You both do." Ned studied Sansa's exhausted form. The way her eyelids drooped every few moments. A single extra day might do wonders for her recovery, but also carried risk. "If you think it's too dangerous," the woman shook her head, "I'll stay as well, at least until we see she's strong enough. I've survived worse, but 2 days of real rest might help all of us. Carl says the village tends to mind its own business. Just don't wave swords or talk about lords and we should be safe." She paused, then added in a quieter voice, "And if they do suspect something, they're as likely to keep silent out of fear. Folk here don't want trouble with the crown either." Ned saw the sense in that. He tucked away the rest of the barley for the morning, then guided Sansa inside the barn. At the far end was a pile of straw that could serve as bedding. The woman tethered her horse in a corner stall. Sansa, brushing straw aside, nestled down, eyes already half closed. Ned took a spot near her, the short sword laid close. The woman positioned herself near the barn door, apparently intending to stand watch. Night fell, and the village lights dimmed. Outside they heard a few muffled voices, the bark of a dog, then mostly silence. Sansa slipped into slumber quickly, lulled by the relative safety. Ned dozed in fits, haunted by the memory of Cersei's cold smile, Joffrey's sneer, the swirl of black and scarlet wings overhead. More than once, he jerked awake, half expecting to see a dragon's maw at the barn door. Each time, he found only darkness, and the quiet shape of the woman leaning against the wall, alert as a wolf at midnight. At some point, Ned woke to the soft sound of her breathing. She had finally succumbed to exhaustion, slumped against the wall with her cloak around her shoulders. He rose carefully, taking up the watch. A sliver of moonlight filtered through the high window. Hours passed in uneasy calm. Once he heard footsteps just beyond the barn, but they faded without incident. In the morning, they coaxed Carl into letting them stay one more day, offering once again to fix anything else in need of repair. He directed them to a hole in the roof of a storage shed that needed patching. With patience, Ned collected spare bits of thatch and lashed them in place, while the woman climbed onto the roof, sure-footed. Sansa sorted wooden boards and nails on the ground below, looking pale but resolute. The sun was warm on their backs, though the wind carried a warning of coming autumn. That afternoon, Carl's elderly mother emerged to see the progress. She squinted at Ned, noticing for the first time the lines of care on his face and the quiet strength in his stance. She offered them cups of watered ale, which they accepted with genuine gratitude. Sansa sipped carefully, mindful of her queasy stomach. The day passed without trouble. When night came again, they shared the last of the barley stew, Sansa's appetite returning enough that she took a second helping. The woman seemed restless, prowling the barn's perimeter and checking the horses repeatedly. Ned suspected she was unused to staying in one place for more than a night. Yet she did not press them to leave, perhaps out of a growing sense of loyalty or pity. On the second morning, Ned woke early and went outside to see the sun creeping over the fields. He drew in a breath of crisp air, letting himself savor the moment. It struck him as surreal that only days ago, he'd been facing execution in King's Landing. Now he was free, though far from safe, with Sansa by his side, and a mysterious woman who had chosen, for now, to remain with them. He heard the barn door creak behind him. The woman stepped out, her pale hair undone from its usual braid, cascading around her shoulders. She paused, glancing at him. "Couldn't sleep," she said quietly. Ned nodded. "Likewise." She folded her arms. "I'm leaving at midday, with or without you." She said it gently, but firmly. "I have a destination in mind, far north of here. You've your own path, I'm sure, but I wouldn't mind the company if you chose to come." Her tone carried an undercurrent of vulnerability, as though she was unaccustomed to seeking anyone's camaraderie. Ned absorbed the words. He thought of the dangers Sansa might face if they traveled alone, and the land ahead was vast and uncertain. If this woman had a plan, or at least a direction, that might be better than stumbling through the countryside without guidance. "We might just take you up on that," he said cautiously. "Where exactly are you heading?" She hesitated, then spoke without meeting his eyes. "West of the Neck eventually. There's talk of Sellswords gathering around the riverlands. But that's not my aim. There's a route I know that cuts through the higher passes near the edges of the Vale. Less traveled, safer from roving armies." Then Ned thought of the Vale, seat of House Arryn, his late friend Jon Arryn's domain. But that was no straightforward path, especially not if the area was embroiled in conflict. Still, it might be a way to skirt the main highways. The notion of traveling with her stirred both relief and caution in him. He still did not know her name, nor her true motives. Yet she had aided them. She had killed for them. He believed she was no friend of the Lannisters. "All right," he said at last. "We'll join you." She inclined her head. "We can leave after we check the horses. Make sure your daughter's ready." "Madame," a rasping voice intruded as Carl approached, looking anxious. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, shifting on his feet. "We don't mind you staying, but some new folk arrived last night. They ask questions." Ned stiffened. "Questions about what?" Carl shrugged. "Soldiers from some minor lord's retinue, or so they say. They're looking for dangerous persons of the north." He looked from Ned to the woman. "I heard them mention a reward." Ned's pulse thundered. He cast a quick glance at the woman, who was already reaching for her dagger as if by reflex. "Where are these soldiers now?" Carl jerked a thumb over his shoulder. "Down the lane. They took one of the huts. Might be heading out today or tomorrow, but if they sniff anything amiss, they could cause trouble." Ned nodded grimly. "Thank you for the warning, and for your hospitality." He pressed a hand to Carl's shoulder. "We'll be gone by midday. We don't want to bring you harm." Carl gave a shaky laugh. "The day I start trusting soldiers over simple folk is the day the stranger takes me. Good luck, friend." He looked at the woman and added, "You watch your back. They look like the sort who'd kill first and ask questions later." "Then Tran." The woman gave him a curt nod, already stepping away to gather her gear. She motioned for Ned to follow. He ducked into the barn, waking Sansa from her slumber. She rubbed her eyes. "What's happening?" she whispered. "Trouble," he said, helping her sit up. He kept his voice calm for her sake. "There are soldiers in the village asking questions about northerners." Fear flared in her eyes. She gulped. We have to leave." Ned forced a reassuring nod. "Yes. We'll pack quickly." He scanned the barn, grabbing the pot, the leftover barley sack, and their few belongings. The woman saddled the horses in haste, tightening the straps with quick, efficient motions. Sansa wobbled as she stood, pressing a hand to the side of her head, but she managed to keep steady. They slipped out of the barn's side door, leading the horses as quietly as possible around the back. Carl had indicated that the soldiers were staying in a hut on the opposite side of the lane. If they circled around the far fields, they might avoid crossing paths. The morning sun was bright, casting long shadows. Ned gripped the bridle of Sansa's mount, murmuring soft encouragement. The horse snorted but obeyed, following the woman's lead. They managed to keep out of sight behind a row of half-fallen fences. At the edge of the village, they saw the roof of the hut where the soldiers were quartered. A single man stood near the entrance, leaning on a spear, but he did not appear to notice them. Tension coiled in Ned's chest. One wrong step, one stray glint of sunlight off steel, and that soldier might raise an alarm. But fortune favored them. They crossed into the tall grass beyond the huts without drawing a shout. Carl, watching from a doorway, gave a small wave. That was their only farewell to the village that had granted them a brief refuge. Ned silently thanked him, hoping that no retribution would fall on these people once the soldiers discovered their quarry had vanished. For a time, they trudged through the grass, the woman leading the way with her horse, Ned following with Sansa. Gradually, the village receded behind them, and the land sloped upward toward the rocky highlands that marked the southwestern edge of the vale. The wind picked up, stirring the grass with a whistling sound that reminded Ned of the lonely moors back home. When they finally paused to catch their breath, they found themselves on a low hillside dotted with scrubby bushes. A meandering path led east, while another branched north. The woman studied the horizon, chewing her lip. "That was close," she muttered, looking back. "Too close." Ned nodded, glancing at Sansa, who swayed with fatigue. "We should keep moving," he said. "Those soldiers might decide to search the area." She agreed. They pressed on, turning north where the land grew craggier, half lost in the rolling green. For hours they walked and rode, exchanging few words. The stress of the near encounter lay heavy on them, sharpening their instincts. Sansa dozed off in the saddle more than once, only to jerk awake when the horse stumbled on uneven ground. As evening approached, they saw dark clouds gathering in the distance. A storm was building, the wind picking up in gusts that rattled the sparse branches. The woman lifted her face to the sky, frowning. "We'll need shelter," she said, raising her voice over the rising wind. "I know of a cave near here, if memory serves, or an overhang of rock." Ned was too tired to question the source of her knowledge. He merely followed as she angled east, descending into a shallow ravine. They navigated the stony path, picking their way around jagged rocks. Overhead, thunder rumbled, echoing off the slopes. Sure enough, they found a small cave entrance tucked into the side of the ravine, partially hidden by brambles. It was just tall enough for them to walk inside without stooping. The horses would not fit comfortably, but there was a wide ledge beneath an outcropping of stone near the entrance, where they could take shelter from the rain. The woman busied herself clearing some fallen rocks, so the horses could stand without risking a broken ankle. Ned helped Sansa inside the cave, where the air felt damp and musty, but at least protected from the elements. Night fell quickly, hastened by the storm. Rain lashed the ravine with a steady hiss, and a flash of lightning illuminated the sky. Thunder followed, making the horses shift nervously. Ned used what remained of the rope to secure them to a natural pillar of rock. Sansa huddled in the cave entrance, wrapping her cloak tight around her. Water dripped from the jagged ceiling, forming small puddles on the stone floor. The woman carried in a few branches she had gathered in haste. They were slightly wet, but the cave's shelter meant they might still coax out a flame with flint and steel. After some effort and cursing, they managed to spark a tiny fire, which sputtered and spat but eventually took hold. Sansa sat close to it, grateful for the warmth. Ned fed it more tinder, keeping the flames alive. In the flickering glow, the woman's face glistened with rain. She set down the burlap sack of barley. "We should cook some," she said, but carefully. We don't have much water left to spare, and the runoff from these rocks might not be clean. Ned nodded. We can gather some in a pot. Let the soot settle maybe. It'll be better than nothing. Thus began a slow, painstaking process of collecting dripping water in the pot, waiting for it to fill, then straining it through a scrap of cloth. The taste would be questionable, but at least it was fluid. By the time they had enough to boil the barley, the fire had grown strong enough to heat the pot. The smell of damp stone mixed with the faint aroma of cooking grain. Outside, the storm raged, thunder shaking the earth, lightning casting split-second glimpses of the ravine. They ate in silence, listening to the storm's fury. The woman kept her dagger close, her gaze darting toward the cave entrance each time lightning flashed. Ned suspected she feared more than just the storm, bandits, or the rumored soldiers, or worse. Sansa, for her part, stared at the flames, likely recalling the dragonfire that had nearly claimed them in King's Landing. At length, their small meal was finished. The storm showed no sign of abating. Rain battered the ledge with relentless force, forming a curtain of water just beyond the cave mouth. The horses snorted nervously, shifting in their cramped shelter. Ned offered them some of the boiled barley water, which they lapped at warily. Exhausted, Sansa lay down on the driest patch of ground she could find, using her cloak as a pillow. She fell asleep almost instantly, lulled by the rhythmic drumming of the rain. Ned tended the fire, occasionally adding bits of damp wood. The smoke wafted around the cave, though enough ventilation filtered through cracks in the stone to keep it from suffocating them. Lightning flared again, lighting the interior for a heartbeat. The woman's face flickered in stark relief. She was huddled against the wall, arms wrapped around her knees. She caught Ned's gaze and sighed. "We can't go on like this forever," she said quietly. "Hiding in caves, stealing from deserted houses, scraping by on barley stew." Ned rubbed his weary eyes. "No," he agreed. "We can't, but we do what we must for now." Her mouth tightened. "I'm sorry if I sound ungrateful. It's just that She hesitated, inhaling the damp air. "I had a life before all this. My own troubles, sure, but not this." He studied her, the flicker of the flames revealing old scars on her cheeks, and others near her collarbone. There was a story etched in everyone, but he did not pry. "We'll endure," he said softly. "We've come this far." She nodded, turning her gaze to Sansa's sleeping form. "Ace, the girl's resting. She seems so young to face all this." Ned's heart clenched. "She is," he murmured. "They both are. My other daughter, Arya. I can only hope she's found some measure of safety." A beat of silence followed, punctuated by the growl of thunder. Then the woman spoke more softly. "If it helps, I've heard rumors of a girl traveling with a group of ragged folk, heading north. They say she had a fierce spirit. Could be nothing, but word travels." "Alan." Ned swallowed, a flicker of hope mingled with dread. "Did you hear where they might be heading?" She shook her head. "Just north, beyond the Trident. Some said it was a group of commoners, might have been deserters, but who knows? Rumors can be half-truths." She paused, noticing the longing in his eyes. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't give you false hope." He reached for the fire, prodding at a sputtering log. "Hope isn't false just because we can't prove it," he said quietly. "I have to believe she's alive." Lightning flashed again, turning the rain outside into a shimmering veil. The woman said nothing more, letting the hush of the storm descend around them. Ned drew his cloak tighter, pulling it over Sansa's shoulders as she slept. In that moment, he let his weariness envelop him. The darkness at the edges of his vision tugged him down to a half-slumber, the thunder echoing through his dreams. He dreamed of Winterfell's walls, battered by a snowstorm. The gate stood open, and 3 dragons circled overhead, their cries echoing across the tundra. He saw a small figure, Arya, running along the battlements, calling his name, but her voice was drowned out by the roar of wing beats. Then he saw Sansa, her face streaked with tears, reaching for him as if from a great distance. Waking was a relief, though it brought only the steady drip of rain and the flicker of dying firelight. The night felt endless, but dawn finally came. The storm passed in the darkest hours, leaving behind a glittering hush in the ravine, water cascading off rocks and rivulets. Sansa rose, rubbing her arms for warmth. The woman checked the horses, who fared the night better than expected, though their blankets were soaked through. Ned surveyed the cave, the floor slick with puddles, the air cold against his skin. "Let's see if the path's passable," the woman said, strapping her dagger to her belt. Rain might have washed out the trails. They ventured outside, picking their way over the muddy ground. The ravine's walls glistened, water dripping from every crevice. A few fallen rocks had tumbled onto the path, but it appeared they could navigate around them. In the distance, the sky was clearing, pale sunlight piercing ragged clouds. The fresh scent of earth and wet leaves filled the air. They packed up, dividing what little barley remained for the journey ahead. The woman gave the horses gentle pats, speaking softly to calm them as they carried damp saddles. Sansa stood by Ned, arms wrapped around herself to ward off the chill. She looked frail, yet there was a resolve in her eyes that reminded him of Catelyn, steady and unyielding in the face of adversity. By mid-morning, they were on the move again, winding through the ravine to climb into higher terrain. The ground squelched underfoot, but the horses found stable footing on the rocky shelves. Sunlight began to warm them, drawing steam from their clothes. They pressed northward in a quiet line, each lost in thoughts of shelter, safety, and the uncertain road ahead. No one spoke of what might happen if the rumors of armies in the Vale were true, or if the mountains teemed with clans ready to ambush travelers. They simply moved forward, because any other option seemed impossible. Sansa, riding with half-lowered eyelids, occasionally glanced at the woman, as though searching for comfort in the older traveler's calm. Ned, adjusting the sword at his belt, matched the pace, every step echoing his silent prayer that they would survive another day. And so, they carried on, father and daughter, and a woman whose name they still did not know, across the wilds of a realm teetering on the edge of war and overshadowed by the return of dragons. Each footfall, each breath, was one more small triumph of life over despair, forging a fragile alliance under the wide sky, bound by hunger, necessity, and the hope of finding a future beyond the reach of the Lannisters' wrath and the distant thunder of wings.